Join us in the fight to restore liberty and American exceptionalism. Together, let's make the case that our charters of freedom are worth defending and honoring. Right here is where the great American experiment comes alive. Let's get to work. All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here. I recognize most of you. Who is here listening to or meeting me for the first time? So, okay, so about half of you. Well, thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited to be here, and it's great to be back. We did this a few months ago, and just had a great time together talking about this particular issue. It's an issue that I'm very passionate about, and you can imagine going out on the college campuses. I've been traveling the college campuses all over the country for the last decade, and this is one of these issues that you can imagine. You're going into Lion's Den, having this discussion because our young people are being taught a certain way of thinking about the pro-life issue, about the pro-choice. And it's interesting, as Jason mentioned, euphemisms are very powerful. Well, we're all pro-choice, aren't we? We believe that we should be able to make certain choices. But in the context in which it's being used, it's not correct. What we're talking about when we talk about pro-choice is the ability to avoid the consequences of a choice that was made, right? We're not talking about pro-choice. That really, the pro-choice movement revolves around avoiding consequences. So when we talk about pro-life, we're talking about taking a preemptive strike to preserve the idea of life. And you know, as Jason mentioned, I was a prosecutor for 12 years right here in Maricopa County. And I was in our gang unit, I was in our homicide unit for some time. And before I went to law school, I thought I wanted to be a veterinarian. Interesting, I wanted to work with animals. Somehow that came true. Even in the criminal arena, I turned out working with animals to a large degree. But as I worked as a veterinarian technician, I did that for almost 6 years before I made the decision to go to law school, and worked behind closed doors and just had a love for animals. And I remember one experience, this was when I was a teenager, probably 17, 18 years old, working in a lab at a hospital out in the Kolbert area. And I remember a dog coming in that was experiencing a lot of attention. She was laboring but was having difficulty delivering the puppies. And I remember one of the first puppies that was delivered was not breathing. It was coming out. I remember just as a young kid saying, that was so distressing to watch. Now, a puppy had been delivered, it wasn't breathing. And I remember the doctor giving me this dog and say, this is what you need to do. And it was really placing my mouth over the muzzle of the dog and breathing just normally. Just normally. And then giving time just to gently press on his chest, and then breathing again. And I labored with this puppy for probably 10 minutes, and the puppy started to breathe on its own, slowly. Now I have to say, my mouth tasted like afterbirth for the next 2 weeks. but you know, that was an experience that I will never forget. And I think about what it was that I did to save that puppy. It was one puppy. And we see things going on in our culture all the time, protecting animals, the spotted owl, you name it. We want to protect fish, but we won't protect human life because we want to call it something that it's not. We say it's a fetus. We don't want to say it's a human being. We want to talk about it being a fetus. Well, no, it's a human being. Because the other side knows that if in fact it's a human being, they have big problems on their hands. We've got to bring these arguments back. So what I'm here to show you today is the way that we move beyond the common arguments that are thrown at us. How do we turn the tables? Because these people come to the table saying we want to debate logically about these things. Okay, well, let's debate logically about these things. Let's talk about your common contentions here. What do you think are some of the more, well, let me ask you, what are some of the more common contentions that we see in our culture when it comes to the pro-choice, pro-life issue? What are the arguments that you hear most often? Yes?
Causes suffering and the child's going to suffer, and you know, and it's too bad on them to have to deal with that.
Right. That's a great one. Yep. The child is born handicapped, retardation. So how dare we bring this child into the world? They're going to suffer, and we'll get to that slippery slope. Who gets to decide? Who gets to decide, and where do we go? The ultimate issue is it a human life? If it is a human life, then we've got to deal on that playing field. Some others, Yes.
Well, some people are saying that if a child is going to be born and unwanted, it's better off
Yes.
not being born at all.
Right.
That's nuts.
If it's born unwanted, it's better not to have the child at all. We'll talk about that contention today as well. Yes?
Shane, I just wanted to mention something that was just recently pointed out to me, is that fetus is a Latin word, and I don't know if you know the definition of it.
I don't.
Yeah, from
Is
what
it-
I understand,
It means
it's
baby.
another one.
Yeah. So again, that goes back to defining our terms, doesn't it? Defining those terms, because they continue to talk about, well, it's a fetus. Thomas Jefferson, the care of human life, not their destruction, is the first and only legitimate objective of good government. Thomas Jefferson. He was the one who wrote the Declaration of Independence, 33 years old. They called him the red-haired wonder. And he talked about liberties, fundamental liberties. The job of government is to secure the rights of the people. What rights are we talking about? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. It is the ultimate objective of government to protect life. And so for someone to say that abortion is not an issue for government to handle simply doesn't understand what the role of government is. These are issues that the government should be looking at. A lot of people say that abortion is an issue for the states to decide. I don't think anything could be further from the truth. I believe that this is a constitutional issue that implicates the issue of life. And when we're talking about implicating the issue of life, this is certainly an issue for the courts to decide, and I believe it's an issue for the U.S. Supreme Court to decide, because I'm not interested in saying, well, just leave it to the states. Well, what happens when California says, well, hey, abortion, that's just fine, and Arizona says that it doesn't? Right? Life is valuable regardless of the state that you're in, and I certainly believe that this was a federal issue, and they got it wrong. The Roe v. Wade, they got it wrong. But there are things to change that. There's momentum moving in the right direction. And I certainly believe if that's the last election, it turned out a little bit differently, we would be on the road to potentially overturning Roe v. Wade. That is possible. Decisions are overturned all the time. That where a precedent is established, we can overturn these types of things. So let's look at some things here. Respect life in all stages. Here's what's very interesting, right? You see the picture up in the upper left-hand corner. Well, none of those pictures look like one another, but yet it's the same person. And we get caught up in the first stage, right? We say, well, it's in the womb. It's we're not able to see it. It doesn't experience certain things that we would normally experience. It's not outside the body. It's not dependent. We'll talk about what those things look like. But the fact of the matter is that if it in fact is life, it must be protected at all stages. Now, here we go. We have to understand the way that pro-abortionists think. And I'm going to let you in on some inside information that we do have about what they're doing on the other side to train their people to come out and combat and negotiate and debate with us. Here is what they say. This is Katherine Kolbert, National Abortion Federation. I want you to pay close attention on what she says here. This is at a training conference where she's talking to people about how do we frame the debate. She says this: I urge incredible restraint here, to focus your message and stick to it, because otherwise we'll get creamed. If the debate is whether the fetus feels pain, we lose. If the debate in the public arena is what's the effect of anesthesia, we'll lose. If the debate is whether or not women ought to be entitled to late abortion, we probably will lose. But if the debate is on the circumstances of individual women, then I think we win. You see where they're going? It's the hardship. We want to focus on the hardship component, and if we focus on the hardship component, we'll win this debate. Right? Hey, the woman can't afford to pay for this. She's in poverty. They think if they drive that argument, they'll win. Right? Our culture doesn't have enough money to pay for these things. There are not enough people that will stand up and adopt these kids. We'll win because, again, we're focusing on the circumstances surrounding the individual woman and what she would do ultimately with that child. This is incredible. Right? Coming from one of the most renowned pro-abortionists in the country. She's telling this to her people. Frame the debate to focus on the circumstances of the woman. Don't go to the pain issue. Don't go to the anesthesia issue. Don't go to the human element issue. Don't go there, because if we do, it's very likely we lose this thing. We know where they're exposed. You know, my young son, he was in karate. He did very well for a lengthy period of time, then decided he wanted to try something else. But I remember going and watching some of these events where they would train him. And one of the coolest things that I learned, I thought it was pretty cool as I watched them, he would have his instructor say, you know what, in a fight, I can figure out where my opponent wants me to hit them. So that sounds strange. And so he would go up and he would show the kids, and he would act like he was going to hit the kids, and the kids would go back like this. And he says, well, you want me to hit you right there? You go back like this. And so he'd hit them there, and then what would they do the next time? Go here. Well, you want me to hit you here? And they would say, your opponent will tell you where they want to be hit. This is exactly what's going on here. They are telling us where they don't want to be hit. That's where you strike, and you strike hard. Hardship does not justify homicide, and neither does inconvenience. That's the argument we've got to drive. That's the underpinning of our argument, is it doesn't matter how hard it is. It doesn't matter how inconvenient it is. It doesn't matter, because what we're dealing with here is human life. We know that it's life for a number of reasons. The moment of conception is when life begins. We know that certain things take place immediately. Metabolism, growth, reaction to stimuli, and reproduction. We know that at about 18 days, the heartbeat begins. We know that at about 40 days, brain waves can be detected. This is human life. There can be no question. We know that it's human life because what it ultimately grows up to be. All of us were at that stage at some point in time. If we didn't experience those stages, we wouldn't be here. It's a growing process, just like the first picture that I showed you. You start as a baby, and that baby is going to look drastically different than when he's 70 years old. It is certainly human life. Size doesn't equal value. Would you say that Shaq is more of a human being than someone who's 2 feet, 3 feet tall? Size doesn't equal value. It doesn't matter if it's this big or if it's 7'8", right? It's a human being, and what we're being told is that size equals some sort of value. Of course, they don't want to talk about the distinction. What they're really talking about is what is in here versus what is out there. Level of development and self-awareness. Are you somehow less of a human being because you're not able to take care of yourself? Are you less of a human being because you're in a coma or when you're sleeping? Of course not. You know, I think one of the common arguments, probably the most common argument that I see out on the college campuses is this. The child or the fetus is not independent. The child is dependent on someone or something else. And then I would ask, well, is that your determination on whether or not this is a life? And many of them will say yes. And I'll say, well, you know, my father passed away several years ago. And 2 months before he passed away, he went into a coma. Are you telling me that he is somehow less of a human being during those 2 months when he was in a coma, when he was dependent on somebody else, when he was dependent on something else? Was he somehow less of a human being? They don't want to talk about that. Logically, it's very, very uncomfortable to talk about that because they know that they've been caught. They can't argue their way out of that. It's very difficult to do. So degree of dependency has nothing to do with anything. We've all been sick. Many of us have been in the hospital where we could not survive without the assistance of someone or something else. It did not make us any less of a human being. And if we want to make that distinction that we're somehow less of a human being when we rely on someone else for our health, that's a slippery slope. Who gets to decide that you now are relying on someone to the degree where now you're no longer that human being, you're something less than a human being? Where do we go from there? Who gets to decide whether I live or whether I die? Yes?
I, when dealing with college students, try to interject, are you dependent on anybody
Right.
in college? And what are who's helping you?
Absolutely.
If you're dependent, then are you less of a human being because you're needing college tuition and dorm, and food and money and all this? So really,
Right, we've got to have them define their terms. If you're talking about dependent, to what degree do we decide that you're dependent on something? Right? Who's helping you get through school? Do you rely on government loans? Right? When you're sick, are you relying on a doctor? Are you relying on a nurse? Are you relying on a drug? Right? Because you're relying on those, you're dependent on something or someone. Does that make you less of a human being? Of course not. Just because the fetus is relying on the mother for nourishment doesn't make that fetus, that human life, any less of a human. Was there a comment here? Yes.
Yes. Shane, I visited, I don't know if anyone here has been to the Mesa Verde ruins in southern Colorado. They're Anasazi ruins. It looks something like Montezuma Castle. So anyhow, I mean, it was thousands and thousands of years ago. And it was discovered that handicapped children, this makes me cry, so excuse me, handicapped children, their lives were extended thousands of years ago. They took care of their weak and their sick. They discovered that by the skulls. They realized that the part of the skull was flat, which means that they were immobilized. And they realized that they actually took care of their weak and their vulnerable.
Yeah, and I think that's a great gauge for ultimately our humanity within the culture, our ability to defend the voiceless and the weak. And we are a culture right now that's not doing those things. We know that we've aborted, since Roe v. Wade, about 55 million babies. That's tragic. And I think about Thomas Jefferson's statement, I fear that God is going to impose his judgment upon this country. Thomas Jefferson was talking about this in the 1770s and the 1780s, that he feared that if we don't do those things, if we're not protecting the liberties of the people, if we're not rejecting tyranny, that there will be judgment come upon us. I mean, those are what our founding fathers were talking about.